Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wrist Watch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time on the bench, we have this beautiful Rolex Oyster Perpetual from the mid-1950s. And I love watches like this. Look at that honeycomb dial, beautiful design. This is a big part of why I love this hobby. And these are the type of watches that I love to work on. And boy, this one has a lot going on as well. It has a crazy story behind it. It's not running well. I'm not exactly sure what's wrong with it yet. And it has had quite a journey to get to me. This watch is actually owned by James Murphy, who has a pretty cool job. He's actually the lead guy for LCD Sound System, which is like a really popular band and one that's kind of been in my life for a long time. So it's a real privilege to get a chance to work on this watch for him. And beyond that, this watch belonged to his dad. And his dad was actually stationed in Korea, and he grew up poor. He didn't have a lot of money. And when he was in Korea, at the end of the tour, they ended up giving them, they called them like army dollars, and they weren't sure if they were going to translate to real dollars back home. So the army guys had a big poker tournament. His dad did pretty good and took the money into the PX and said, okay, I want to trade this in for whatever I can get so that when I get home, I can sell it, give the money to my mom, because he was the sole breadwinner at the time for the family. Now take a look, by the way, at how this thing is running. It's a disaster. It's a snowstorm. It can't even get readings on amplitude or beat error at all. And we're going to have to find out why. Anyway, when he got home, his mother insisted that he hang on to the watch and only sell it if really necessary. And really cool, he actually kept it his whole life. And I think, you know, James said that he thought it was maybe a point of pride for his dad that he never had to sell the watch. He was able to get himself a good job, support his kids, his family, his mom, and he never actually had to sell the watch. So let's get into it. Let's see what's going on with this thing, and let's do what we do. We're going to restore this and get it back into working order so that it can get back on James's wrist and he can enjoy it going forward. Taking a look at the movement here, this is a Rolex 1030 movement. This is a fairly early automatic for them, but you can see it does have the full rotation rotor here. That thing spins 360 in both directions, just like that. And it will wind the watch either direction that it's going. You can see there's some wear on the side, and what's, ooh, I really don't like to see that. The balance wheel looks loose. It's not tightly fit in. It is trying to run, which is nice. Let me see. Oh yeah. See, when it tips back and forth like that, that's a very bad sign. That usually means that the balance staff is broken, and the balance staff is like the axle for the balance wheel. And if the watch gets dropped or hit really hard, it can occasionally break, and that may be what we've got here. Take a look at the inside. You can see this watch was made in 1954. There's a little mark in there. Also, a lot of watchmakers marks on it, meaning that this watch had been serviced numerous times over the course of its life, which is a good thing. Now we can go about taking the movement out. What I do on this channel, and what you come along with the ride for the ride with me, is I restore these things. You know, I used to work on cars a lot with my dad. He passed away. I moved into an apartment at some point. I don't have room for cars and all the tools and everything. And eventually I found watch restoration, honestly, here on YouTube, and started to try to learn how to do it. And it's become kind of my #1 hobby. And thanks to you watching these videos with me, it's also become a big part of my working life. I love producing these videos for you. So thanks. I appreciate you coming along. And once again, take a look at the dial here. I absolutely love it. Again, the watch is running. This is fairly typical for a broken balance staff as well, is that it will run in one position, like right now we're dial up, and then it'll struggle if it's dialed down, for example. And that's because one end of that pivot, again, that axle, is broken and isn't able to engage fully with the jewel that surrounds it, but the other end is. And so when the weight's on that end, it'll spin a little bit. Now, what it won't do is run well ever. Even when it is technically running, it's not going to be keeping good time. And it's of course not good to leave it broken like that and running. So first we'll take off the hands, and then we'll start getting into this thing by taking off the dial. Dials are usually held on by screws on the side of the movement, and they push up against a post on the bottom of the dial, and that's what actually holds it in place. And that's the case here for this watch as well. I love that dial. Oh, it's so cool. All right, we get a look at the underside of the dial side of the movement here. Now I can just put the dial in one of these little holders. It's always important, especially for me, because like I'll have to set these projects aside for a while I search parts or figure out what's wrong or edit some videos or whatever. And so I like to keep things really safe. This is a Canon pinion removal tool that I got actually off of eBay. It's a vintage one and I restored it. It works fantastic. It just needed a little bit of cleaning, a little bit of oil, and all of a sudden I've used that thing for a few years with no issues whatsoever. It's of course one of the fun parts about this hobby and many hobbies are the tools. Can take off the automatic winding bridge and the automatic works that's attached to it. If you do want to get into this, by the way, as a hobby, I highly recommend it. I know you probably don't think you can do it, but I actually think you probably can. I did it. I think if you're mechanically inclined at all, you can get into this. And I actually started a website where I've curated toolkits to help onboard you so you don't have to make those big decisions about what tools to get and am I getting the right ones and all that kind of stuff. It's called sutcliffehansen.com. I started it with my friend Alex, and yeah, I'd love it if you check it out. There's toolkits for kind of every level to get you in if you haven't done this type of thing before, or even if you're further down the line, there's other kits there as well. So first thing that we need to do is let down the power. That takes away any wind that was in the mainspring out of it, and then we can remove the balance. As I mentioned, I'm very concerned about this balance situation, and working on the balance is also the trickiest part on a watch because there's so many delicate, and in this case, quite old parts. This watch came out in 1954, and it's been worn. Like, this thing didn't sit in a drawer for its whole life either, so it's got some wear and tear on it, no doubt about it. Now I can take off this extended wheel. This actually drives the seconds hand. So the seconds hand that was going around in the middle, this wheel is what kind of brings that turning energy over to it. This is just a small spring that sits on the back of the seconds hand pinion, which is in the middle there, and keeps a little bit of tension on it. This is actually a dual purpose screw as well. It holds that part in, and it is also holding part of the train wheel bridge as well. There's 3 screws total. That was one of them. And then there's these other 2 that I need to take off before I can reveal the train of wheels. This right here is the seconds hand pinion that I mentioned. And now we can take off the train wheel bridge as well. So let's see how things look underneath. This is one of my favorite parts because it's really cool looking under there. And yeah, beautiful Rolex movements. They just show you the train of wheels so nicely. I can move over now to the barrel. Before I start taking out those wheels, I should just take off the barrel bridge as well so that nothing is stuck. Oh, speaking of stuck, that was a little bit jammed up in there. Okay, now I can take off the crown wheel. This one is held on by 2 offset screws. You can see that not only is it not one in the middle, but it's also 2, and then they're kind of down towards the bottom. That's because that middle plate stays still, and then that gear turns around it. Yep, just like that. And there's a little shim that goes on the bottom as well, and we'll take that off too. And with that out of the way, now we can start taking off the train of wheels. We'll start with the center wheel here in the middle. And then the 4th wheel, which has that extended pivot that other wheel was sitting on top of. And now the 3rd wheel. And then the escape wheel here as well. And this is also a fine time to take off the pallet fork and the pallet fork bridge. I also like to try to take a look at stuff as I'm disassembling it. You can do a full inspection after everything's cleaned up and you can put it on the microscope or get it under a loop, but you can learn some things about what might be going on with the watch, particularly if they're like catastrophic type things, by just paying close attention as you're disassembling it. Again, the real gut of that actually happens a little later, but stuff will stand out to you, no doubt about it. Like, for example, I have a very strong suspicion that the balance pivot is broken on this, and that was because I was paying attention when I first took it apart. Okay, now we can take off the barrel bridge, and that leaves us almost completely disassembled on this side. I can take the barrel out. Everything's looking okay here. I mean, it's worn. You can see wear patterns all over this movement, but it's not like worn out. Now I can flip the movement over and start taking apart the keyless works, and that's really the last part. The keyless works and the motion works are together. Keyless works are what allow you to wind up the watch as well as change it from being in wind mode to hand setting mode. And the motion works are the gears that actually turn the hands themselves. They turn the motion of the movement that is, highly regulated and all that into hands turning. So they're quite important too. Okay, I can take off the yoke, this intermediate wheel. There's another one here. And now I need to remove the setting lever, and that means turning the movement back over and undoing the setting lever screw. And now I can just simply remove the setting lever. It comes out easily. And with that, I can remove the crown and the stem, and then I'll see the sliding clutch and the clutch wheel as well. Now we can turn our attention to the automatic works. So I can start by taking off the rotor. There's this little 4-pronged spring that actually holds that rotor. Whoop, there it goes. Thankfully not too far. That holds the top of that rotor onto a pin. So I should be able to just remove it now. Yeah, there we go. And then as you can see, it's actually jeweled underneath as well. Rolex doesn't mess around. That is often not jeweled on movements, especially ones of this age, but this one is. And now I can continue disassembling the automatic works. I've got 2 reversing wheels here. These are like gears that are in place so that whether the rotor is spinning clockwise or counterclockwise, it still winds the watch either way. Older versions of these type of movements will only wind the watch when the rotor's spinning in one direction, but it won't do anything in the other. So this makes it a little more efficient. It'll wind it up a little bit faster, etc. Okay, so not too bad. It comes apart quite easily. Ooh. You seeing that? Yeah, that looks like a piece of jewel. I see a couple of those now, and it looks like they've come off of that big center jewel. Interesting. That would, along with the balance staff being broken, that would be the indication of a large shock to the watch. And I don't mean electrical shock. I mean like it got dropped or thrown or whatever. Oh yeah, this one hasn't been serviced in a while though. Whoever serviced this last did not change out the lubrication there. There's a lot of grease down there at the bottom. Yeah, you can see it actually, can't you? There's like a shattered kind of top on that. I'll have to take a look at that in a little bit, but that looked like that jewel took the brunt of it as well. And I'm really starting to think that this watch may have just been dropped. Now we can take off the arbor as well as the mainspring and take a look at how it looks. I'm planning on replacing it, but it is, interesting to see what kind of mainspring's in it, if it's a modern mainspring or an old one, and what condition it's in. And it's a modern one, and it looks okay, actually. Okay, now we can get everything ready to go into the watch cleaning machine. And this will give us kind of a clean slate from which to work, right? Because this watch, needed to be serviced for sure. And we won't really know what we have until we put it through the 3-step cleaning process of the watch cleaning machine, which will clean off any old, of course, dirt and debris, but also residue from oil. The oils do dry up over time, and we'll want to make sure that they're all good to go and cleaned off so that we know what we're working with. Now, I also need to work on the case itself, though. I'm not going to be doing any full restoration work on this. This watch was worn by James and his father, and we want all of the marks and everything that they've put on it together to stay on it. But it does need to be cleaned, and I probably am going to replace the crystal. I'm thinking it looks pretty banged up, and it'll probably be worth it to replace it so that we can display that beautiful dial. But as far as the actual case itself goes and the bezel, you can see a lot of dirt under there. Again, this just hasn't been cleaned in a long time. This is really normal for this to build up like this, but unless you actually take the time to take the thing apart and clean it, this kind of dirt will build up in there. Okay, so that brings us to the watch cleaning machine. So we're going to put the movement parts through a 3-stage clean. It's a initial cleaning. These are all solutions that are meant specifically for watches and cleaning watches, and then 2 rinses after that. And while the thing goes through the watch cleaning machine, I did want to mention that I've got a Patreon for this channel. This is one of the ways that I support the channel, and I just wanted to say thank you to each and every person who supports me over on Patreon. It really does mean the world to me. Patreon is a really cool site where you can support your favorite content creators directly. There's nobody in between. And for mine, you get a thank you card and a Wristwatch Revival sticker in the mail, no matter what level you sign up for. So if you'd like one of those, you can sign up over on patreon.com/wristwatch revival. And once again, I wanted to say thanks to everybody who supports me there. It does mean the world to me. Now, take a look at how everything looks after it's been out of the watch cleaning machine. Beautiful. And yeah, that's a lot of parts. It does kind of add up. Let's take a look on the microscope, and yep. Can you see what I see? There's a point on the bottom, and the top part doesn't have that nice clean point. It has been worn off or broken off, and that's because this thing does in fact have a broken pivot. So we're going to need to fix that. Taking a look at the crown tube as well. This is what the crown screws into. You can see that it's also taken a hit and has some gouges here. So probably worth it to replace that as well while we're here. It will also improve the watertight nature of the watch, that type of thing. Speaking of that, the gaskets, there's 3 of them that kind of make up the watertight barrier for this watch. This one's inside the crown, and as you can see, it is heavily deteriorated and it just looks terrible. So I'm going to get that out of there and replace that with a fresh gasket and some silicone grease as well that will help keep it waterproof and sealed up, because this gasket is definitely past its due. And I gotta say, there's something weirdly satisfying about digging these gaskets out of here, but it's also kind of gross. All right, there we go. And there's another gasket here inside the crown tube. So we'll just use my tool here to grab that. And this is, of course, just prep for the case parts to go into the ultrasonic cleaner here. So we can put each of the case parts in, the case back, the bezel, I'll throw the crystal into, and the case itself. And then this goes into a detergent solution that then gets put in the ultrasonic cleaner. But it's really great. It'll clean up all the dirt and loosen up everything that's even in hard to get places, but it won't remove any of the patina or anything like that from the watch. So it's a really nice solution to do that. So everything out of the ultrasonic cleaner now, which means that we can get back to some real work here. So let's start off with this balance situation. So at least we know that it's got a broken balance staff. And that means that we need to replace it. And the way that you replace a balance staff on a watch like this is actually quite involved. It is riveted into place. So if you look really closely here, this is cool. Do you see that mark on the balance? That's actually showing me where that stud is supposed to go. So that looked like it was good. Now I can use special tools to remove on this side of the balance. There's 2 sides of it. This side has the balance spring on it. It's also known as the hairspring. And the reason for that is that it is extremely thin and extremely fragile. As you can see, this one is blued as well. And now I've taken it off of there, but I have to be really, really careful with it because it's a very, very fragile part. Now, if you take a close look here on the other side, there's a little piece of metal that's attached to it, and that's the roller, and that has the impulse pin on it, or impulse jewel on it as well. Now, I do need to take off the roller, and then I also need to take out the old balance staff. But luckily, I have a tool for that, and that's this little thing. There's actually numerous ways that you can go about this, but I've got this really cool tool. It's called a Platax tool. And basically, it allows you to take off the roller and then also to remove the actual balance staff from the balance wheel. So what it does is it lines it up, and then I can just do a firm press with my fingers to detach the roller and the jewel itself. So as you can see, it's just sitting right there, and voila, I'm able to take it out and just simply set it aside. Now, I do still need, though, to take out the actual balance staff. And again, this is riveted into the middle of this wheel, but thankfully, this tool has that covered as well. So as you can see, it has a little tube that goes over and it surrounds that hole so that you don't bend or damage any other part of it. And then you can use a little punch and a hammer to just knock that out and break the rivet. So that's what I'm going to do here. If you take a look, it lines up perfectly, and then bang, just like that, it comes right out safe and sound. So this is a really clean and easy way to make sure that you don't damage anything when you take it out. And there's the old balance staff right there with that rounded off broken part of the balance. So now we have just a bare wheel here, right? There's nothing riveted to it, you know, and there's no spring on it, and there's also no roller on it. So the first thing we do is we're going to go back in the reverse order, and we're going to re-rivet a new balance staff into place. And this is a very, very stressful, touchy operation. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my staking set, and I'm going to find the smallest of the holes here on this plate. As you can see, that one won't quite fit, so I'll go back up one, and that's going to be my base that I use to do the riveting. So now I can center this up. So this is just called a centering punch. It just has a point on it, and I can lock that plate in with that wheel on the back, and that means that wherever I put down a stake in there is going to be directly above that hole. So again, I'm going to put the new balance staff in place, and now I can take the wheel, and I can set it over the staff where the rivet's going to be. And then I can use punches plus a hammer, a hammer, to re-rivet the wheel. So the punches will be rounded on the tip or flat. This one's flat just to get the wheel seated properly. And this one's rounded to spread out the rivet. And these parts are so small that it feels weird to use a hammer, and you really do need to use like very light tapping, but this is it. Turn it, and a lot of power goes through that stake and onto that rivet. And so I'm just trying to make sure that it's cleanly distributed around the edges. I'll lift up here. Sometimes it'll get stuck on the stake a little bit, but that's normal. And I can put it back in place. And as you can see, the rivet is already starting to form. And now I can flatten it down again using a flat punch. So the tip of that punch is actually flat, and that will fully seat the rivet into place so that this wheel is strongly seated and not going anywhere. And there we go. Now I want to do a quick test to make sure that everything lines up properly and that there's not a wobble in the wheel or anything that's out of alignment. So without the spring or anything, I'm just going to put it back on the movement with the balance bridge over it, and I'll just use some air to blow on it to make sure that it's spinning freely and that everything's lined up properly before we continue. Because if it doesn't work here, well, you don't want to do all the other stuff in between. Okay, let's see if it goes. Woo! Definitely. So that looks really good. And I think that gives us the green light to go ahead and continue to reassemble this balance. Now I'm going to use the jeweling tool. This is yet another tool. You can use a staking set, but I saw Ashton from Precision Horology here on YouTube. He's a real watchmaker. And sometimes I get tips from him and watch his channel to learn new ways to do all of these things. And he likes to use a jeweling tool. So I'm going to try that for this one. And I get why. I think it'll work really well. Now, one issue, though, is that the jeweling tool actually has a little point on the tip of it. And we'll use those to replace or to remove jewels so that it stays centered on the jewel. It's a spring-loaded tip. But right now, I want to be able to push over the balance staff, or around it, if you will. So it's cool though. You can just take these apart. It's just 3 little parts that come out. So this is a stump, or this is what you put on the bottom part. And now I can put the stake on the top here. Again, the one that I took that out of. And all I have to do, you can see, is I can put the new wheel with the new balance staff on it. And then I can line up, in this case, I'm going to start with the roller for the jewel. And then I should be able to just press it down over where the new little, you can see the little tip pointing out there on the new, on the balance staff there. And then again, I can be very controlled with this jeweling tool because you turn it to put it down, and you can even measure increments by how much you want to put it down rather than having to kind of just push down and pray. And so this allows me to kind of carefully adjust the pressure that I'm going to do. And yeah, that worked really well. Yeah, I think Ashton's correct here. I think I'm going to use this from now on to reassemble the balance, because that felt much more controlled once I found the right parts for it. Now, I do need to put on the balance spring as well. So I'm going to take a different stump here. Again, that's the bottom part, so that it can accommodate the roller on the bottom. And now I can put the spring back on. And again, if you remember, I need to make sure that point right there, that little nick on the corner of the dial, or excuse me, of the wheel, is where that stud gets lined up, because I need to put this back the way it was before. But thankfully that mark is on there. That actually comes from the factory from Rolex, though. If it gets moved around, you'll often see watchmakers make a new mark. I think more modern watchmakers would use a Sharpie or a pen of some sort, but yeah. And again, it's the same thing. See this, the pusher goes around the edge of the new balance staff and allows me to push the collet, that's that metal piece in the middle of the spring, down into place. And yeah, that felt much more controlled than on a staking set for me, at least. So I like that. I'm going to be doing that going forward. Now I need to put the balance complete, as it were, back onto the balance bridge. And again, that just means lining up that stud and then screwing it into place. It's very, very touchy work. But now we can give it a try, and I'm just going to put it on the bare main plate here to make sure that everything looks good, that the wheel can spin back and forth. Again, I'll just do a little bit of air blowing on it to make sure that things are moving freely. That is exactly what you want to see. And we have now replaced the balance staff, and we've got a balance that is ready to go back, hopefully, into a functional watch. Now, we've got some work ahead of us here, though, because the reassembly process now begins. So the first thing I'll do is take some of this dark grease. This is called braking grease, and it actually goes on the inside of the barrel. This is for all automatic watches. If you have a watch that is not an automatic, you don't need to use braking grease like this, but you do for all automatics. And there's our new mainspring going into place as well. And as you can see, it's held in place by a metal disc, and I can just simply push the mainspring into its new home. And now I can put the barrel arbor into place. This goes in the middle, and it has a hook on it that grabs onto the mainspring and it lets it coil inwards. That's what the power from the watch comes from. In fact, all of the power from the watch comes from that spring, at least the stored power. Technically on this watch, the power also comes from you, or in this case, James. As he moves his arm around, it'll swing the automatic rotor and wind up the watch. But where it's stored is right there in that mainspring. And anything you see on the watch that moves or ticks or does anything comes from that as well. It's just a piece of coiled up metal. It's really simple. Okay, so now I can put the barrel into place, and now we can start building up the train of wheels. So we go in reverse order to put them back into place, starting with the escape wheel and then finishing with the center wheel. And this is a little bit of a tricky process. You do get used to it, I will say, but at first it can be a little bit tricky because these have pivots, again, like an axle, on the top and bottom that need to go in a jewel. And a jewel looks like a donut, right? It's got a hole in the middle and the pivot goes into that hole. And every one of these has to be lined up top, bottom, and with each other before you can start screwing down any of the plates, because if you don't, you're pretty likely to break something or to damage something along the way. So that's why I take an extra minute here to make sure that each of these is properly seated and lined up before taking a shot with the train wheel bridge, which is what this is here. And again, you just want to make sure everything's lined up before you start putting it into place. This is a gentle, slow process. A lot of watchmaking is, I always tell people that are getting into the hobby to take your time. And I don't just mean that like, within one session. I mean, over the long term, like if you set a goal, today I'm going to put the mainspring back in the barrel. That's it. You sit down, you get out your tools, everything, like almost all your tools will fit in like a shoebox, right? It's really cool, this hobby, because of that. And then, you do one part and then you leave it, and then you come back the next time you have a little bit of free time and you do the next little section. You don't have to do everything all at once if you don't want. And I think that helps with like patience and not getting frustrated, because of course, like any good hobby, it can be frustrating. Okay. So now we've got the train bridge, in place and secure. And we can continue the rebuild here on they call this the watchmaker side of the movement. or some people call it the movement side, I think. And this, interestingly, is a part that actually really cares about the other side, which is the dial side of the movement, but you do need to put it on now. And now we can put on the barrel bridge as well. And again, this is the same thing, you just want to make sure everything's seated. This is much less delicate as a part, but it's important to just take your time. And that also means that we can install the click spring and the click screw. A click is a really simple device. It's actually just a ratchet, basically. It's a mechanism that makes it so that the ratchet wheel can go one direction and not the other. And, that makes a lot of sense. Like when you wind up a watch, that's actually what you hear. You're actually hearing this part here. That's called the click itself. And it's bumping up against the teeth from the ratchet wheel. It's none of the gears. It's none of the other stuff that we've done. It's not the mainspring itself or anything like that. It's actually that clicking sound is that click just bumping up against those gears. That's all it is. When you get really deep into the hobby like this too, like you can tell, you can sort of kind of feel out the different vibes that each of the clicks have. They have, when you wind them, they feel different and they also sound different. Some of them are kind of crunchy and loud, and some of them are really smooth and soft. It's really, I mean, you're getting into the weeds at that point, don't get me wrong, but that's the cool stuff, right? Like that's the little details that you only know when you really get into a subject. So now I can put on that ratchet wheel. And again, me doing this is the same thing as winding it. And as you can see, since the power isn't being stopped, it just unwinds any power that's in the mainspring immediately again. And the whole point of a watch movement is to slow down the unwinding of that spring to a very specific rate. This one, for example, is meant to do it in increments at 18,000 times in 1 hour. That's if this watch is doing that perfectly, then it's keeping perfect time. Okay, now we can put the crown wheel on and these little tiny baby screws that go with it. I think these are probably the smallest screws on this movement. They are very small by any standard that you would use normally, but I will say by watch standards, they're on the smaller side of things, but some movements have much, much smaller screws than this. But Rolex is traditionally quite merciful when it comes to things like that. They build really, really good movements. I know you're probably not surprised to hear that, but their movements are like bulletproof. Now, this one's from 1954, so you would not use that word to describe a movement of this age and condition, but like you get a modern Rolex watch, especially, their movements are fantastic. They're very utilitarian also. I think that Rolex, kind of has a reputation for being maybe fancy, right? Or it's like this high-end thing, and it is, but they're very utilitarian in the way that they design and produce their watches. Most of their watches aren't about being fancy. They're about doing the job and doing it really, really well. And they actually do. Okay, now we can put together the keyless works, sliding clutch and clutch wheel in place. I'm using some blue grease here. This is the thick viscosity grease for really high pressure point items, ones that are going to be metal on metal, or you're going to be using your hands or your finger to manipulate them. That's a lot of force for such a small part. And so you want to use that grease to protect those parts and make sure that, there's no major friction going on where little shavings of metal could come off and damage the movement or something like that. Okay, now we can put on the setting lever screw. This is a little bit of a tricky operation as well. It's useful to hold it in place with your finger and then use your other hand to screw it down, because the screw for it is that one I put on a little while ago, again, that I said was on the other side of the movement. So it's a little bit of a tricky operation, but you get used to it. This red oil is like a medium viscosity oil, and it's used for parts that are under decent amount of friction, but not quite as much as the others. Like this post right here that this yoke is pivoting on. It's metal on metal, but it's not under like tremendous pressure, and it doesn't move that much. So you can use something like the red medium viscosity oil there. It's called HP 1300. It's made by a company called Mobius. And they made all the oils that I use on this. They're kind of the top one. They make synthetic oils. They also have some non-synthetic, but most of their lineup is synthetic now. They're really high quality oils. Frankly, they're like a revelation. They're the type of quality that you could not get when this watch was made. And when this watch was made, people were still using a bunch of organic oils that would deteriorate much quicker and some weird stuff too. I have a watch repair manual that was from a little before this watch was made, and they're using like whale blubber and like just this stuff that I'm like, really? Like, how did you even get your hands on that stuff at the time? But yeah, now it's all really high quality synthetic oils. I can now put on the setting lever spring, which is kind of a dual purpose part. Most watches use them like this. It's a cover plate that kind of keeps those wheels in place, but it also has that arm sticking off of it, which is a spring that puts pressure on the setting lever. And the setting lever is what actually changes whether you're in hand setting mode or winding mode. So when you grab your watch and you pull the stem out, you know how it has that little click? That spring is what's providing the tension for that little click. And there it is right there. You can see the whole thing kind of shift over and then shift back. That's that click that I was talking about. Now, again, that is metal on metal. So that's going to take the grease, the blue grease. The 9501 is the name of that grease. And this will help, again, not only just with the friction of keeping the parts safe and not producing any type of like metal shavings, but also it makes it a little bit easier to use. Like it makes it nicer to actually pull that crown out back and forth again as well. Now, if you may have noticed that I didn't put the pallet fork here into the watch cleaning machine. That's a precautionary measure. You can usually get away with it, but the jewels at the end of this fork are held on with an organic adhesive called shellac that you heat up, basically melt it, put it into place, and then it'll dry very, very hard. But it can become loose if it's in a watch cleaning machine materials for too long or solutions for too long. So I'm just going to clean it manually using a solution called One Dip. It cleans it off really well, and it means you don't have to leave it in there for very long. Now I can put the pallet fork into place, and the pallet fork bridge goes on top of it. And there, you see how it seated itself? You need to make sure it's seated again before you go screwing things down, because you're liable to break something otherwise. Okay, so now we've got that in place, and I can put some wind in the watch, and now it'll actually stay. And I can check really quickly to make sure that the pallet fork is jumping back and forth under the pressure that it's under from the mainspring, and it is. So now I can tighten it down fully. And that means that we are just about to see if we got this thing running properly again or not. So let's put our brand new staffed balance wheel into place and see if this thing's going to run. Again, we need to make sure that the new pivots line up with the jewels. And they weren't. So I'm just going to kind of reset again here. This is something that happens. Again, patience is a big deal. I'm going to make sure that the pallet is where I want it to be before I actually put it in place. And we're going to give it another try. Okay. Get everything lined up here. Come on. Ooh. Some signs of life. Give it a little kickstart, maybe. Well, it looks like it wants to run. Yeah, okay, we've got... Oh, it stopped. Okay, well, it does look like it wants to run, and that's a really good sign, because remember, besides, this watch has no lubrication on it as far as, like, the running of the watch. I put on some for, how you change the hands and stuff like that, but this thing doesn't have any actual lubrication going on it. And yeah, it does look like it wants to run. So we are very, very close. It's pretty low amplitude, as you can see, meaning it's not running very powerfully. I can give it a little encouragement with some air, but it does look like it slows back down to kind of low amplitude pretty quickly. So that's encouraging, but not exactly what we want to see. I think what I like to do here is go ahead and oil it. So we're going to lubricate this watch, and then we'll see kind of where we sit after that. So this is called 9010. This is actually the lightest viscosity oil that we use. And again, you put it right next to the jewel, right where the pivot is, and it's meant to actually suspend itself there. And that way it'll provide constant lubrication for the watch going forward, and it'll last usually something like 5-7 years, maybe something like that. Okay, now we can address the shock settings on the top of and bottom of the balance. So this is a 2-part setting, as you can see. I can take this Rodico, which is kind of like silly putty for adults or people that are pretending to be adults but really just making watch videos. And what you can do is use that to help pull those little parts out, and then I can put it in the one dip. That, again, that's that solution that cleans it, and then I can re-lubricate it by putting a tiny dot of that 9010 oil right in the middle of that jewel, and then I can replace the bottom part of the jewel, whoop, jumpy little thing, like that, and then put it back into place, and that'll suspend oil directly above, which is definitely what we want. As you can see, the watch is running now, though it is still running pretty slow, as you can probably tell. This is a shock protection system on the top there, and it actually has a shock protection system over here on the escape wheel as well. And this one I'll need to remove, although not fully. I need to basically put this shock spring, which is what this kind of helmet shaped thing is, and I can just simply push it out of the way without actually removing it all the way. I learned that one the hard way, by the way, and I can remove this. Now, this is a little bit different of a setup. It's just a cap jewel. So there is no whole jewel that goes below it. So I can do the same treatment here, though. I'll put it in the one dip, make sure that it's all sparkly clean, and then I can add a little tiny drop of oil to this as well before replacing it back in the movement. This is very, very touchy work because that droplet of oil has to stay within the confines of the jewel. And if it goes to the edge, it'll come out when you put it in, and you have to go do it over again. So there we go. We've got that in place, and now I can go ahead and put this shock spring back into place. Again, these shock springs are there so that if the watch gets dropped, it doesn't break the pivot, though in this case, the shock spring failed. Not that shock spring, but another one did. And this is actually the shock spring on the bottom. Oh, look. Wow, you can actually see where this failed. Do you see where it's breaking apart? That's supposed to be one part. I have never seen that before. Wow, so now I guess we know why that thing broke. The whole entire spring actually gave out. So now I need to remove this one because this needs to be replaced, or it's going to have the same fate, you know, the first time you drop it or it gets hit really hard. So I'm going to try to just remove this. Oh, okay. Well, it looks like I was able to push that metal ring down far enough for it to jump away, and that's good. Here's the new one. So this is, again, a brass shock spring. And I've never actually replaced one of these, so I need to figure out how I'm going to get it on that loop. That metal ring that you see there is what holds it into place, and then the backside of this spring has a little hook on it. I'm going to try to use a screwdriver to kind of create a little bit of space, and then see if I can push this down into place. Let's see if I can do it. Oh, finicky. Oh, I got it. Oh, you know what? That actually wasn't as bad as I thought, although it was kind of tricky. I mean, I am on a microscope here after all. So now after oiling the jewel here, I can replace it. And now I've got a brand new shock spring on the bottom as well, so that if the watch takes another hit, it's not going to break the pivot. And that must have been exactly what happened there. And now you can see the watch is running much, much better after having lubrication. And let's see how it does on the time grapher. Oh no. Weird. Okay, so I actually can read the amplitude and a little bit of beat error, but I think that what's happening here, let's take a look. Yeah. So I think that what's happening is that the hairspring, which is that blue spring there, was rubbing up against the bottom of the balance bridge. You see where it's touching over there? I think that it was actually rubbing, and the way the time grapher works, is that it's actually a really sensitive microphone that picks up the sounds of the watch as it operates. And if there's something making a bunch of extra sound, you won't be able to get a reading. And that's what we saw. And I think that sound was this spring rubbing up against the bottom. So that means I need to do some hairspring work. This is about the most, this is like the most stressful work you can do on a watch. You use 2 pairs of tweezers and you kind of gently bend and manipulate the hairspring, but they're so fragile that like one wrong move and you can ruin the thing. Now that looks a little bit better to me, a little bit flatter to where it was before. And that means that we can try to give this thing another shot on the time grapher. And as you can see, we have a real reading now. So that's good. That solved that problem, but it is running a little, the beat error is off a little bit, 1.6 milliseconds. And I'll show you what that actually is. Do you see that red jewel down in the middle? And then there's those 2 posts just like a little bit upstream. That is where that jewel rests. It needs to rest naturally, directly, and I mean directly in between those 2 posts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this collet ever so slightly. Watch. That much. And that will move the relative position of the balance. And let's see if that jewel that you can see at the end is directly between the posts. Hey, that looks about perfect to me. And that's a bunch of trial and error. And after doing that and regulating it, look at where this thing ended up. How incredible is that? 0 seconds plus 1 second, 0.1 milliseconds off. Beautiful. We finally have this movement running well again, even after all of those steps that we had to do. Now take a look at this jewel. You can see that it's been shattered. And I noticed that also on the automatic bridge, this jewel is also shattered. So these are going to need to be replaced as well. Now I was able to source a brand new jewel for this. And by the way, these parts, very expensive. As you might guess, they're no longer produced, so they're quite hard to find. And in fact, I couldn't find a jewel to replace the other one. So I bought a whole new balance bridge here as kind of a donor part so that I could take the jewel that I need out of it and put it in. So the first thing I'm going to do is on the actual balance bridge is I'm going to take off this little cover so that I can remove that center jewel that's in the middle because, well, we need to replace that one as well. So I think I can just push it out by hand here. It's just friction fit and it's held on by that stand. Yeah, it just comes right out with a little bit of pressure. So this is the broken center jewel for the automatic works. Again, the automatic works actually sits on top of it. And so if it's broken, it'll grind on it and it won't operate very well at all. And guess what? We need to take out the jeweling tool again. That's right. We're back on that because this is how you remove and replace jewels. So what I'm going to do is take an appropriately sized stump, and then you can see the top has a little pusher. And what it'll do is I'm going to remove the jewel that I want from the donor plate here. And it just simply pushes it through down to under, actually it just goes through a hole and then you'll see it right there underneath. So this is the jewel that I want. And now I can remove the one that looked like it was shattered, you know, when we looked at it on the microscope there. And this one works the same way. I'm just going to push the jewel out through the bottom, and then we'll have just the hole there that we can put the replacement jewel into. And again, it'll just get pushed out to the bottom of the tool here. Oh, yeah, it was shattered all right. You can see there's just shards left over from that jewel. And even though it was technically like functional-ish, you know, it wouldn't be operating at peak efficiency at all and definitely would shatter fully at some point. So we'll start by putting in the new center jewel. And I think I can just kind of press this into place. Like I don't think I need any special tool for this. Just kind of gently. There you go. So it just seats itself and then I can put this cover back on top. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, this is the jewel that the rotor will rest on. And so it is really important that this jewel is in good shape so that that rotor can spin freely. Okay, so that looks good. And now we can replace the other jewel as well. So you can see that there's that big hole sitting right there. And so all I'm going to do is take the replacement jewel and sort of get it mostly seated into place. And then I can gently reseat the new jewel and push it down to my desired depth. And there's actually a little gauge on the side of the jeweling tool that'll allow you to measure that depth too, so that you can make sure that you put it in at the same level that you started at. Okay, so there's a new jewel in there. And how does this look? That looks good. Jewels in there, the 2 of them have been replaced, and that thing should be working very well once again. So now we can reassemble the automatic works itself, and that's just putting things back the way we found them. And now that we have the new jewels in there and everything, it should be functioning very well. For the reversing wheels, I'm going to use a kind of a combination material or solution. It's called Lubetta. It's for kind of doing cleaning and lubrication at the same time. And basically it evaporates, but leaves like a film. So it cleans and evaporates, and then it leaves like a thin film of lubrication behind for really tiny sensitive parts like these reversing wheels here. Now I do need to make sure that the little reversing arms within the wheels are properly set apart. I mean, this is some finicky stuff here. And then I can put on this upper part of the wheel with these little arms that go down in there. And then I can simply put this whole thing back into place as well. And just make sure that everything's lined up as far as the jewels and everything goes. And then I can screw it back down, and we'll have the automatic works mostly back together. We've still got actually a few more steps to go on it. I do need to make sure that these jewels are lubricated as well. These pivots, as it were. Just requires a little tiny bit, but it helps it run it, again, a little bit better efficiency. And this is the main post here for this rotor. And again, this is going to go on where that jewel is. So you see where that goes down in the middle. That's where that new jewel that we replaced is. And that's also the one that broke when this thing was dropped. And by the way, I did mention it to James that it looked like this thing had taken a big hit. And he said it had. He said that he was going through the airport and it fell. A TSA agent or somebody accidentally dropped it off of a ledge and it fell onto the cement floor. So that's kind of the nightmare for every watch owner. And as it turned out, it had a major impact on this watch, literally and figuratively. Okay, I can also replace that little spring clip at the top and I can put it on. If you look closely at the edges here, do you see where this is worn? That's actually from that rotor getting loose and turning around and touching that part of the movement and taking the plating off. These movements are made of brass, but they're typically rhodium plated. If you see them when they're looking that silver color that you see here, and this one is as well, it's rhodium plated. And that plating can come off quite easily. It's mainly cosmetic. It can get completely out of hand at some point, but this watch doesn't look like it's been through quite that much. So now I can put on this extended wheel that runs, again, the seconds hand, and then the little spring here that acts that does two things. The little spring holds on to the back of the seconds hand pinion, and then this screw holds that in place, and also is the other screw for the train wheel bridge as well. Little 2-for-1 here for Rolex, well designed. I gotta say, just seeing that watch just hum along like that, it's such a relief. And it's also, it makes me very, very happy to see this thing running as it should. Okay, now I can put the automatic works bridge back on. It kind of goes over everything. You can do this after the watch is already in the case, or you can do it now. It's kind of a up to you type thing. But I'm going to put it on right now. And we can also check the clearance for that rotor against that base plate. As I mentioned, if it gets loose or damaged, it can actually rub. You can also make sure that it's actually winding the watch, whether I go counterclockwise or clockwise. And take a look here. Yeah, do you see how there's some clearance now? Before that, since that jewel was broken, it would actually sag over and rub up against the movement, as I said. Now, I did also notice, though, that this... that the case tube where the crown lines up, it had some damage on it. So I think it would be worth it to replace that as well. And I've got this special tool. There we go. That removes the case tube. and I can install a new one. A new one will have new threads on it, and it'll be a little bit more water resistant and a little bit more sturdy. This one was functional to a point, but it had that damage on it. And I would worry that over time that would become a bigger and bigger problem. And eventually the crown just won't screw down to the case at all anymore. And then you can be in trouble, with getting water in there, and it kind of makes the watch unwearable. I'm going to use a little bit of Loctite here. This is a non-permanent version of Loctite, and I'll just put a little bit on the threads so that I can make sure that this thing again stays water resistant and stays in place. But this level of Loctite, it is, you can undo it. So it's not forever. It's just a little additional helper there. So what I'll do is I'll get the thread started, and I'll take that same tool. It has a special splined end on it so that I can fully install and screw in the new and hopefully more functional case tube here. And there we go. You don't want to overdo it. Now we can flip the movement back over and get the dial side all taken care of. What do we need to do over here? Well, kind of the basics. I need to put on the dial and the hands. So that's, about it. And by the way, I mentioned it before, but that dial, oh my God. I love that dial. It is so gorgeous. Super vintagey vibe on it, right? But it's just like you can tell it's had a good life. We'll start with the hour hand as usual. Since this watch doesn't have a date function, I can technically put the hour to whatever I want. I'm gonna choose noon, but yeah, you could put it on 3 o'clock or 7 o'clock or whatever. Now I can put the seconds hand on and make sure it's lined up after I put on the minutes hand as well. You can see it kind of grabs on a little bit, and just be nice and gentle here. There we go. And there we go. Seconds hand off and running as well. Now the case, it is out of the ultrasonic cleaner and it's looking much, much better, but I've got this brand new crystal to put on it, and I think it's going to look really good with that dial. Now, in order to fully install the crystal though, I need to put on the bezel, and the bezel goes around the crystal and it's friction fit. It's pressed into place, and it will actually act as a grip on that crystal to make sure that the crystal is watertight as well. So I'm going to use a special die here that goes around the outside, and I'm going to use my Rober press, which is just a hand operated press, to firmly but gently put the new bezel into place. That's it. That's all it takes. Just a good firm press, and take a look. Oh, I love how this is looking already. I'm really excited to see how this one finishes up, just because it's been such a journey with this thing. I mean, I've had to do kind of everything to this watch. Normally you'll find maybe 1 or 2 of these issues or 0 of them, but this one, it took a big hit, and it took it badly. I mean, it broke 3 or 4 parts on it, and then it had a bunch of extra stuff as well. Okay, so I'm going to use an air blower here to make sure that there's no dust or debris, and then I can start to recase the movement and everything itself. Rolexes are usually like this, where they kind of dip down, and then you turn the whole movement around until it's lined up, and then you can lock it down with the case screws that are there as well. First, though, I'm going to go ahead and put in the crown and stem just to make sure that everything's aligned properly. And then I can, again, I mentioned it, but I can use these case screws to hold the movement and dial and everything firmly into place. Now we can put the case back on as well. And we're almost done. Oh God, this thing's looking so good already. I love this watch. If I could just work on these all the time, I would be quite happy. Now take a look at the spring bars. They're bent. That was done on purpose. I don't think it's really necessary for this watch though, so I'm going to replace it. I'm going to replace them, because if you do bend them, it can compromise them a little bit. And, most watches that need that have a really, really tight tolerance. And this one is a normal watch, so with normal lugs. So I'm just going to go ahead and put on fresh spring bars. I'm going to keep these for James as well. So like if he wants to go back to the others, no problem at all. But I am going to do that, and take a look at this watch. Oh my goodness. I absolutely love this thing. That beautiful dial. And thank goodness it's running again. And what an honor. You know, it was really cool that James reached out, and we had a lot of really great email conversations about it. And I could just tell how meaningful this watch was to him and to his family, and what it means to him to have his dad's watch and to get this back on his wrist. Really cool to get a chance to do a restoration of this level. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for the journey. If you want to find me on Instagram, I am wristwatch_revival. Feel free to come over there and say hi and check out what I'm up to over there. Otherwise, I just wanted to say thank you once again, and we'll see you next time.